Hi guys, Omores here. So what do you think? Is it possible to use an M.2 NVMe SSD on a Pentium II PC? I know it sounds like one of those trick questions you may get asked in a Google job interview or something like that. Now, the Pentium II came out in 1997. PCI Express hit the market around 2004, and NVMe SSDs came along about 10 years after that. So using an NVMe SSD on a 1997 motherboard doesn't sound like something that should be even possible. But if you understand how PCI Express works, it starts to look actually doable, at least in theory. So why are we even talking about a PCI Express since a Pentium II motherboard has classic PCI slots and definitely no M.2 slots? Well, M.2 NVMe drives are nothing more than standard PCIe devices. They just use a different physical connector. That means any NVMe drive can be plugged into an M.2 to PCI Express adapter, which does nothing fancy. It simply maps the M.2 pins to their PCI Express slot equivalents. And the reverse is true too. You can pull a PCI Express slot out of an M.2 slot if you need to go the other way. Alright, I guess you already know where I'm going with this. Yes, PCI Express devices can be plugged into a PCI slot. All we need is a PCI to PCI Express adapter, one that uses a bridge chip like the PEX8112. What that chip does is act as a translator in both directions. It tells the NVMe SSD that is running on a PCIe X1 connection, and at the same time it tells the BIOS that it's dealing with a regular PCI device. The bridge chip doesn't actually need to do much heavy lifting here because PCI Express was specifically designed to be software compatible with the original PCI architecture. This means that even an older BIOS can still detect the PCI device, allocate resources for it, and hand it off to the operating system, just like it would with any normal PCI card. That's exactly how I managed to install a GTX 980 on a Pentium III system. So in the same way, our NVMe drive should end up looking like just another device on the PCI bus. And once we get to that point, everything comes down to having the right drivers for it. But before we get into drivers, there are two more things that can get in the way. First, there is the PCI slot itself. Early PCI slots only provided 5 volts, while later PCI revisions also added a 3.3 volt rail. This usually isn't a big deal since many PCI cards are universal and can run in either 5 or 3.3 volt slots. However, for our M.2 NVMe setup, 3.3 volts really matters because this is the standard operating voltage for M.2 NVMe SSDs. So if the 3.3 volt rail is missing on the actual PCI slot, the adapter can't do anything about it, and the NVMe drive won't power up. The good news is that this Intel 440BX motherboard does provide 3.3 volts for the PCI slots, so we're good to continue. But for example, the Socket 7 motherboard with a VIA MVP3 chipset doesn't provide a 3.3 volts on its PCI slots. So on this board, our PCI to PCIe setup simply won't work unless we're willing to do some modding. The second thing that can cause problems is the BIOS. The NVMe drive is running behind an extra PCI to PCI bridge, which is technically perfectly valid. The PCI specification actually allows up to 256 bridges, but some early BIOSes don't handle this very well, and either won't scan beyond the first PCI to PCI bridge or won't allocate PCI resources correctly. So let's see how this goes. Now, except some early drives like the Samsung 950 Pro, NVMe SSDs don't include a legacy option ROM for BIOS boot support. Instead, they rely on the motherboard firmware to contain an NVMe driver and initialize the drive during boot. And obviously, that's not the case with a Pentium II motherboard, or really any motherboard released before the NVMe standard existed. One interesting workaround for older systems is to load an NVMe-capable bootloader through a network card's PXE option ROM. This is something very useful, so I'll cover that in a future dedicated video. But for now, let's boot from a SATA drive and see if we can get Windows 98 to recognize the NVMe SSD. Why Windows 98? Well, that's what most people had on their Pentium II PC. I know I did. And if NVMe and Windows 98 sounds like an impossible relationship, well, it is not, because as of late 2025, we actually do have a brand new NVMe driver that works with Windows 2000 NT, and it was ported to Windows 98 as well. The original Windows 2000 and NT version was made by Dominic Baer, while the Windows 98 port was done by Sweet Low. Both versions are easy to install and actually pretty reliable. Now, since the NVMe driver was already installed on my Windows 98 SSD, at the first boot, the NVMe drive was picked up right away, and the driver asked for a restart. But a driver can install and still not work. I've seen that plenty of times before. So the moment of truth was basically one restart away. And guess what? Now we have a functional NVMe SSD in Windows 98, which is nothing really new here on the channel, except this time we are running it through the classic PCI bus. So I guess it's time to celebrate this with another song. I know you liked it last time. This time I'm recording through a Creative Sound Blaster 16, and honestly that's one of the main reasons you would want a Pentium II system in the first place, because it still has ISA slots. Wait for the lyrics and then we'll check the transfer speeds.
Pentium time, 97 board, but I'm feeling fine. Dropping NVMe in the PCI line. Bridge chip talking like, yeah, that's mine. Old BIOS looking at me confused. 3.3 volts in the drive gets juiced. Windows 98 like, what's this thing? Driver kicks in, boom, now it's singing. You can't run this, but we run this.
NVMe on a Pentium II, we done this.
You can't run this.
Cut makes a second and the crowd goes nuts with it.
Alright, now let's check some transfer speeds. Unlike PCI Express, where we have plenty of bandwidth on the PCI bus, the total bandwidth is just 133 megabytes per second, and that bandwidth is shared between all devices on the bus, not per device. In practice, usable transfer speeds are actually a bit lower because of PCI bus overhead and protocol encoding. So in Crystal Mark, we get around 100 megabytes per second read speeds. The bandwidth is directly tied to the PCI bus frequency, which normally runs at 33 megahertz. So if we overclock the system and the PCI bus goes up to around 36 or 37 megahertz, transfer speeds already increase to around 110 to 115 megabytes per second. And if you remember that earlier video where I tested the same NVMe drive with the same PCI to PCIe adapter on an PCIe X1 slot, I got around 200 megabytes per second because there the bridge chip was running at 66 megahertz. So what can I say? Compared to a classic IDE drive from the Pentium II era, an NVMe drive is in a completely different league, as it should be. But in practice, software meant for Windows 98 will still load fast enough even from a regular IDE hard drive. One thing to keep in mind though is that this NVMe setup can run at 66 MHz, so it should remain very stable even if the PCI bus gets overclocked. Next, I ran the same tests in Windows NT. Over a PCIe connection, this Samsung NVMe drive can hit about 1.4 gigabytes per second. Seeing these kinds of numbers on a 996 operating system is not bad at all, even if they are still below what a typical Gen 3 NVMe drive can deliver. Of course, the NT NVMe driver will also work over the PCI bus, but the results are basically the same as in Windows 98, around 100 megabytes per second at stock PCI speeds, and about 110 with some overclocking. Alright, so we can definitely call this a success, and honestly, I don't think this is just a because we can type of thing. I mean, you may already have a retired NVMe SSD lying around, and if you want the fastest low power storage for a classic PCI system, this whole setup is still way cheaper than going with a compact flash card, which to be fair behaves like a regular ID drive, so it's more compatible, but the cards themselves aren't exactly cheap, and you still need an adapter. And speaking of adapters, someone has already taken this NVMe on a PCI idea much further. I'm talking about Daniel from SDZ Mods, who recently came up with this crazy thing, a PCI X to NVMe adapter that also works on the regular PCI bus. On PCI X, you can get up to 1 gigabyte per second of bandwidth, and this adapter got pretty close, reaching around 800 megabytes per second on an SGI O2 system. I really hope I can get my hands on this X-Bridge card soon, although I don't actually have any PCI X systems right now. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video, and if you made it this far, please check if you're subscribed to my channel. YouTube tells me around 90% of my viewers are not, and I feel like I should probably do something about that. I don't know. Omores out.